Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of this Horus Heresy podcast. I'm joined today by my illustrious lore master of incredible knowledge, integrity, so many other great things. This is Ed from Sandman of Terror.
I'm
Say
also
hello, Ed.
tall. Yeah.
Also
Hi, man.
tall.
Good to be here.
Ed is joining me on this second episode of this podcast, and today we're talking about false gods. This is following directly from Horus Rising, the last episode. If you haven't seen that, definitely go check that out. This podcast is mainly for if you guys are listening, you don't really want to read the entire Horus Heresy, no problem. I've got you covered. We're going to go over the entire thing of the Horus Heresy, literally the entire Horus Heresy at some point. But today we're just doing the events that will be, I'd say, pertaining to, we've seen the rise of Horus. This is probably more the fall of Horus. And I'll give a book review kind of at the end of it. But today we're almost going to go straight into the episode and we're going to explain basically where we left off from Horus Rising. So, I mean, the part I will say asked Ed, because the books Horus Rising do start with, the iconic line, "I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor," which, I mean, your opinion on that, though, how hard did that one hit?
Sneaky Dan Abnett. Yes. Yeah. Very funny at the time. Well, very confusing, actually. It was the first Warhammer book I read. So it is objectively kind of confusing. And I guess it speaks to the mindset with which they wrote these early books. This was at a time where, the Warhammer 40k is still pretty new, or at least a lot of concepts of it are. Like Malkador as a character has existed for a few years by the time this book has been written. Do you know what I mean? So it's, things were kind of slow to come about, and they planned for these 3 books that would open up this timeline, but they didn't necessarily plan to do all the 64 books as they ended up doing, plus however many other books that are connected. So yeah, I guess it's important to bear that in mind, and especially when you read, to Fulgrim, for example, things go so quickly compared to things that happen later on, where things slow down to a massive degree, and that's kind of why, is because it was a very different time in Games Workshop's history.
I think, although again, I think he starts this book as a pretty iconic drop, where the book literally starts with, "I was there the day Horus fell," which again, I feel like goes quite hard. And we're going to get straight into essentially where we left off, which was everyone enjoyed Horus Rising, because obviously Horus was a very charismatic man, and we followed like characters like Loken or Euphrates Keeler, Ignace Carcassy, who shout out to Pancras No Work Colin, who really loved the fat bastard, the lurcherous individual, Mr. Ignace Carcassy. Following this, the events of Horus Rising, there was a short war, and the Interrex civilization that we briefly saw, they are essentially dead. And now the expedition has arrived in the Davin system, where at the end of Horus Rising, if you remember, Erebus asked personally, Mr. Sneaky Boy asked personally if Horus would do him a favor and appear in the Davin system. And the book kind of opens with this character who's new, it's called Petronella Vivar, and she's a noble born of Terror, one of the noble families from the early days of the Unification Wars, who'd recorded the Emperor's history. And she's a remembrancer, so similar to ones like Euphrates Keeler and Ignace Carcassy. She's one of the Order, but she obviously, it's implied like she's a cut above / a bit more important. And she has this bodyguard called Magard, who is essentially a augmented human. He's not an Astartes. He's just a overpowered individual who has a unique blade. He's also mute, so he can't say anything at this point. And Petronella has been sent to be the personal documentarist of Horus Lupercal, the War Master, which is a pretty big deal. I should also mention she's a giant bitch. Like, it's implied. I don't know if you thought this, Ed, but like, I think when I spoke to Graham McNeil about this, which was a great thing in my life, amazing that ever happened. He said like he purposely wrote her to be kind of like an awful, snooty person. Did you dislike her instantly, Ed, when you first came about?
Yes, very much so. I don't think they really hold any punches with that. I mean, she's basically used her her family connections to get this massive position. It's implied. So yeah, she's inherently a nepo baby of the 30th millennium.
And Horus kind of, he's a charismatic individual, and he's basically toying with her. Like when she comes in, she's dressed all, to finery and perfection, and then he's just like this gruff ogre of a man pretending to be, even though he's obviously probably way smarter than her. And he's just toying with her, but she has an outburst and she thinks she's messed it up, but he actually laughs and he says, like, to Malagast, his equerry, oh, she's perfect. She can be my personal documentarist. And this is where the book switches to the part where we see the rest of the expedition. We see some of the pilots of, the great Titanic fleet. It's not just Astartes in these fleets. There are enormous, like millions and millions of people with Mechanicus and equipment. And we switch to the pilots of the Titans Dies Irae, and they're discussing some concerning things. But before we get there, would you care to explain, Ed, like what is a Titan?
It is it's kind of like a car, but significantly larger, a few more guns, and yes, a crew of people that control it. They are colossal war engines of various size. There's somewhat of a joke in the community about the inconsistent writing around the size of quite a few of the Titans, but yeah, they are colossal war engines, and as you can imagine, they determine a lot of battles within the Horus Heresy and the 41st millennium, because they're still about. But there are significant battles that are based around Astartes fighting so they can deploy their Titans, and that's where you see the Astartes having a lot of importance in that respect. But once the Titans are down, it's if you've got Titans, the other person doesn't, it's likely going to be game over.
Like literal colossal chunky like Walker engines of like it's one of those things, like it's a relic of an old era that's somehow turned into a war machine in this 31st or 31st millennium age. And when we're seeing like slight indications of like what was seeds planted in Horus Rising, but growing a bit more here, which is that certain individuals, like the pilots of the Dies Irae, which is like a really famous Titan, are talking about the Levitio Divinitatis has come up a bit. We've explained that a little bit in the last episode, which obviously is the growing background worship of the Emperor. But this is where we kind of first see, like, amongst like crews and individuals, there's a divided loyalty between some people are like, oh yeah, we serve the Emperor of Mankind, and others are like, no, we serve Horus. And then it's like, you mean the Emperor of Mankind by serving Horus? And they're like, yeah, sure, that's what I meant. So there's like little seeds of divided loyalties that obviously maybe later push towards the brink and even worse. We also have another seed switch to Mercedes Ollerton, the Remembrancer, who first interviews Loken. And I think I would say at this point, I think Loken probably admires her. I think it's hard to describe the relationship between them. I wouldn't say it's like an actual. I mean, I don't know for you, Ed, like what you think. How do when you like with Astartes and mortal humans,
Yes.
It's almost like they can't. Like, do you think they could be friends, or there's something more to like?
They are definitely friends. We see that in the Heresy. That it's quite funny.
Not more to it as in like romantic. What I meant is like they.
Well, I was going to say,
yeah.
Like, the Astartes are sexless beings fundamentally. Yeah. Like I think I can't remember if it's this book or another book, but there is a moment where Loken does walk in on her, and she has clearly been having relations with.
Oh, so with the Euphrates Keeler, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Is it Keeler?
Yeah.
Oh, I've got the wrong way around. Never mind then. But yes, no, they are certainly very close, and she is able to challenge him on the ideals of the Imperium, and it's a really interesting relationship, because you get an understanding of how Space Marines' minds work, because of course they've been through a huge amount of indoctrination, but at the same time they're still kind of equipped to battle logically with ideas that might challenge the way the Imperium runs.
I think particularly with Loken, who's a lot like the POV character for this opening stage of the Horus Heresy, it's good like when he talks to characters like, Cinderman, who's an iterator, who we discussed in previous episodes. Obviously, him being a very learned man, and he's like a tutor for Loken, and Mercedes kind of his personal, again, like what Petronella is to Horus, Mercedes to Loken. But she also questions him. She asks him like, well, why, and he sometimes doesn't really have a good answer. Loken at this time is obviously this is post Interact, so he feels like there's been an unnerving suspicion of something, with the incident in the Whisperheads and other stuff. He's also not used to his new armor color, which is the Sons of Horus, like teal green. I don't know if you had a feeling, Ed, where like, do you prefer like the Lunar Wolves like color scheme, or were you more Sons of Horus?
Oh, yeah, Lunar Wolves all the way. It's just always very funny when the idea of Horus changing the name of his legion is built up to be like a really big thing in the first book, that he would establish himself as the War Master, and he chooses just the most uninspiring name. You know what they are, I guess.
I will say, I do love the battle cries. Still always ring like so cool. Kill for the living, kill for the dead is. I will shout that on important occasions in my life.
I've always loved the chant just Lupercal. It's just, it goes so hard.
Yeah.
Just that like Lupercal.
Lupercal.
Yeah. It's just the way in my head you hang on the U and then you come in hard with the Pacao, and it's just if I was in a shield wall, I'd love to chant that. Should virtual reality get that good, I would definitely be shouting that.
Yeah, shout out to the future games where we can actually play as some legions. Would be really cool. But we also
I was just going to say actually. Sorry, because you mentioned Loken. I was going to say that Loken is definitely not very happy with how things are going, because the warrior lodges are certainly something that he's not very happy, because it is already suggesting that Erebus has got his claws a little too much into the Legion, and he's not very happy that this is kind of bisecting command.
Yeah, as they say, he's a straight arse or something, isn't it? They call him. He's a clean boy, so this really irritates him. There's also some background parts here about the system they've arrived in, which is they've arrived in the Davin system, which has a main planet and some moons. Previously, there's some background lore of they were just tribes living on Davin and its moons, and they were brought into compliance by the Lunar Wolves, and importantly, the Word Bearers as well, which is Erebus's Legion / Lorgar's Legion.
And what's interesting about that is that he finds out in this book that the concept of the warrior lodges actually comes from Davin's moon. It comes from the cult, the Serpent Lodge, and so it's things are really starting to flare for him, because he was the fan.
Too many red flags, definitely, and Horus at this time, just a brief bit of context, Horus has been the War Master for not just shy of a decade, I'd say, not super long, in terms of their lifespans. And he's been dealing with the new bureaucrats on Terra, the mounting relationships between his brother's legions, and it's a huge weight of responsibility. And then Horus tried to be something new and different with the Interact, and then it basically blew up in his face. He had that famous scene where he literally looks up into the sky and says, why have you abandoned me, father? And I wanted to ask Ed, Horus feels different, doesn't he? He doesn't feel like he always do you feel like it's almost the real Horus, or is this this is someone who's in severe work stress Horus?
One of the things that we do know about the Emperor and Malkador, because they do talk about this in later books, but I'll mention it here because it probably will seem a bit obvious to some of the people after the first book, is that they deliberately set the Primarchs off to battle against each other. You mentioned that scene where he's talking about his brothers, and I love that scene. She's talking about how difficult it is to work with some of his brothers. Not everybody kind of bows their head when Horus gets made War Master, so it's very fractious. So a lot of what he's feeling now is still exacerbated by the nature of the Emperor and Malkador, but I think a lot of it's just kind of general nerves. He's worked hard. Like having Erebus within his legion is arguably a sensible step in terms of he's trying to integrate the legions together. He's trying to capitalize on the relationships he has amongst brothers, Lorgar, Fulgrim, Sanguinius, these strong connections that he has. But he's getting first decade jitters on this new job, I guess.
First decade jitters.
Yeah.
I think Horus is, I get the impression like it's the cracks maybe show the ego slightly beneath. And as you've rightly pointed out, like the burden of War Master is pretty high. And I think I did that. He literally says that when he's talking to some of his sons, like about like sometimes his ego's a bit hidden when they question him about Malagos questions him like why do you need this personal remembrance, or Petronella, and he says to him, am I so insignificant that I don't require remembrance? Like there's obviously you can tell like he's obviously half joking, but then with the Horus we have now, it's almost like, is he though? It's an interesting I think it's a thing where I think Dan Abnett, the author, clearly puts that in there to imply like maybe that's the real Horus, but it's up to the reader's opinion of like, is he still just behaving like a charismatic individual? You guys so good?
Yes, I was going to say, I think this is Graham McNeil.
Oh, sorry, Graham McNeil. Apologies.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Graham McNeil. No, good creation. No, but I'm sure they probably discussed that, didn't they, between the two?
Yeah.
The Horus and his legion is, as we said at the beginning, it's summoned to Davin, and they arrive on Davin, the main planet's surface. There's a grand conclave set up in this enormous yurt, and it's like a whole sort of political show, as Horus often does in his courtrooms. Loken arrives and he pulls aside Mr. Lurcherous, fat and potty mouthed Ignace Carcassy, and asks him, he'd been given Loken's personal protection in some capacity, and he says, listen, just keep an eye open just for things. I should also point out here, Ignace Carcassy he's astute, but also he keeps, so when I say astute, just point out he does stare at Euphrates Keeler's rack the entire, for quite a lot of it, which is
I'd be staring at her head. She's got like a massive head, doesn't she?
I think that's still Mercedes Ollerton has.
Oh fuck! I get them confused. Sorry,
yeah, I get the remembrances are all.
I'll only do that 5 more times this episode. That's
right. Then in this great conclave, some instead of the sea of green armor, some new soldiers arrive, and they're in grey. They're in grey armor. Who is Erebus, Ed? Who is Erebus has showed up? Who is Erebus?
Yes, I mean, if you search Erebus into YouTube, you will see quite a few videos entitled "The Most Hated Man in Warhammer" or something to that effect, and it is understandable. Erebus is such a bastard. He's not even really Erebus. Like I don't know if you'll cover his novel at some point.
But you can say what happens. Yeah, go ahead.
A fun thing about Erebus is that his name wasn't originally Erebus, but he had parents that said, you really need to be more like Erebus, who was another boy that lived but near him. And so he ended up killing that boy and taking the name. He was essentially always, from a very early age, had been corrupted by chaos. I don't know how he passed the trials and spent so much time in the presence of the emperor and didn't get found out. But he is the ultimate bastard, and
he's a high chaplain on the Word Bearers Legion at this point. No spoilers for some of their lore, but because that will be covered in another novel. But essentially, Erebus, as we saw in the previous episode, has shown up, and a lot of the guys have liked him because he's actually been very helpful. He's quite charismatic, similarly to Horus, but in a different way. He's kind of like a scholarly type. And in this great yurt, Horus and the Mournival, Horus does this once again. He's like, Mournival, play your part. We're doing the whole, good cop, bad cop thing. They begin this grand speech. And then Erebus interrupts and he says, in the whispery tone, he says, War Master, literally like that. And Horus is not, you don't interrupt the Lupercal. And, Horus is you can actually see he gets pissed in front of people. The mask kind of drops for a second and he goes you better get out what you were trying to say to me because I'm not happy. Because he says, Horus is saying there's nothing wrong with Davin, it's all compliant. And Erebus says, no, Jugendtember, your friend, the mortal governor who you placed here, decades ago, he's betrayed you, Horus. And Horus is unbelievably like incensed, and he declares that wherever Jugendtember is, which is currently on the moon, he says we're gonna go, we're gonna bring him out in chains, and I'm gonna scream in his face, and I'm gonna dig him out of the hole, basically. So they will go and attack the moon. Post this meeting, though, this is where Ignace Carcassy comes forward, and he says to Loken, "Isn't it funny how obvious that was?" And Loken says, "I don't know what you mean," because Ignace says, "Well, clearly." Because Erebus said, he interrupted the War Master, and then in the same scene he said, "Let's speak about this in private," even though he interrupted him in public. Erebus is clear. Ignace says Erebus is clearly trying to go to the moon, which obviously Loken doesn't like. And then overhearing their conversation, someone else appears, Abaddon. Abaddon, Ignace stupidly asks Abaddon what was the silver coin he gave to Erebus. Abaddon, like, the attack dog that he is, almost tries to run over, and like a snarling animal tries to kill Ignace Carcassy, who whimpers, and he runs off as Loken holds him back. This is where we find out that like Loken interrogates him, and he says, just tell me the truth, what's going on. And then Abaddon says, I can't say, because he's a member of the lodge, and they all say they can't say anything about the lodge. It's literally Fight Club. What happens in Fight Club stays in Fight Club. But we do find out, Abaddon tells him Erebus didn't join the lodge. Erebus brought the lodge to us, that he founded the lodge. Which again, Loken's like hackles whatever are screaming at the top here, though. It's there's a lot of mysteries going on here. Then we get to another scene here, which is Loken will speak to Erebus. He rocks up to Erebus. They're currently on travel, and they're watching the warp while they travel to the moon. Loken brings up something he was reading from Sindaman, which was the Chronicles of Ursh, which is, I think, about the Unification Wars, isn't it? It's about the
yes,
which again, we'll explain a bit more about that in some more episodes. But essentially, this conversation boils down to, there are things such as concepts of demons, possession, things like happened like Xavier Jubal in the Whisperheads in Horus Rising, and then things like chaos. And Erebus is, if he had eyebrows, I'm sure he would have raised them.
Tattoos.
His tattoos raised up a bit, which obviously we learned the same concept, chaos, from the Interrex, who are now dead. And then this is when Loken realizes, Erebus just lied to me about something. He said he didn't know what you're talking about. And he's like, no, he realizes he's lying here. Only a few, and then we get another scene switch here, which is when we switch to the Mournival here, which I love this scene. I don't know how you feel about this, Ed, but this is the Mournival, which is Loken, Abaddon, Aximand, and Torgadon. And Loken is concerned because they're this is the first time they're actually going to fight a rebel world. They're not conquering a new world. And he randomly chucks out there, what if Astartes rebelled against us? And then they're all laughing, what a ridiculous idea, man. Which is weird, because in the timeline, Astartes have fought Astartes, and other things like Space Wolves and World Eaters have clashed, or the Lion has totally attacked. Dark Angel would probably attack the Space Wolves in some way, because they love that.
Well, also you have one of the key aspects of the Great Crusade that we don't know a lot about, but sort of fascinating, and we did a whole stream on this, is the 2nd and 11th legions have disappeared at this point. We don't know what happened to them. They're known as the Forgotten and the Purged. And given that one of them is called the Purged, presumably a legion has been destroyed, or at least the Emperor has. Because one of the things the Emperor does is he uses his immense psychic power to manipulate people's memories, and this will come up later in the Heresy. Foreshadowing there for you. So presumably, the Lunar Wolves will have known that a legion was destroyed, at least one. So who knows?
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. So the idea of full on Astartes versus Astartes legions things is it's tapped on a little bit. I think Sigismund briefly mentioned the idea in Horus Rising when they had a small meeting, but it's a horrifying concept. But But they all just tell, Loken, you're being silly. They start having fun. They literally start horsing around. Tarek Torgadon, who's got perhaps the strongest mustache in all of Warhammer, he starts saying, there's a story about me and the bear. And they all hate this story. It's a great scene because he can't stop telling the story. Horus, Mr. Lupercal appears in the great hangar hall. He's been boasting to Peshnel Vivar about, like, oh, my legion's history, like on Ullanor, where the Great Triumph had happened and he became War Master, where he's like, oh, I killed so many orcs there. He's like, he's really showing off. And then basically they walk over to the Mournival, and Peshnel is staring at them because they've all been horsing around and like rub each other's heads and stuff like that. And they all stand up straight. And this is a great moment where Horus asks his sons to preside over his oath of moment, which, Ed, could you briefly explain like what is an oath of moment in Warhammer?
Yes. So an oath of moment is a vow that you take before a battle, something that you intend to accomplish. So, how many bears does Tarek Torgadon intend to take on the next fight? that kind of thing. And so, I mean, they do happen in other contexts as well. But yeah, typically they're taken before battle somewhere, and they make a promise of something they intend to fulfill. And if you fail too much in your oath of moment, then you can become an oath breaker, which is as you can imagine, a bad thing.
The obviously, even still to this day, if you look at the 40k models, it's the little parchment paper with like wax seals on it. It's a tradition that even in the Horus Heresy or Great Crusade continues on to the 40k. I don't know if the Trace Legions probably do it, but definitely the Loyalist Legions always still carry this out. And when Horus he kneels down, it's an incredible moment because people are like, "Oh my god, the War Master, the Primarch is kneeling to his his sons," and Loken even his hands shake when he's doing it because it's like, "Oh my god!" It's a huge moment. And then they basically go to they get suited up and they prepare to attack Dabin's moon. The expedition. I guess I could.
I should say as well, I hope I'm not misremembering this. I'm pretty certain in this scene, this is about 6 decades since the Sons of Horus were last on Davin. So I believe they would expect Yugen Temba to be dead pretty much at this point in time, which is important context, I think, for what happens later.
I think they it's because it's a slight side part of lore, but sometimes with they think Yugen Temba's still alive, but he'll probably be a really old man / rejuvenant treatments, which is basically Imperials often get their life expanded by a certain amount. But Yugen Temba is a mortal man. But
and I guess it's important to mention this because it does show just how long this has been planned. To Loken's theory, if the word bearers or Erebus have been planning this, they've had a long time to plan this very specific sequence of events.
Yeah, so Yugen Temba should be pretty old by now, or / the fact that the betrayal supposedly of Yugen Temba comes as a surprise clearly maybe implies he's not been betraying them for decades. It's been a more
Well, you know what it will be actually. I think what I'm thinking of is because they find his crashed flagship as well. So this is decades ago. So I imagine they would. I don't know. Maybe I'm adding this in my self. No, I've always assumed they thought he was dead.
I think it's a valid point. Yeah. I think it's probably quite. I think it maybe happened immediately after Horus left, possibly.
Yeah,
because it's just the moon. So there's the expedition launches their attack and they go to Dabin's moon. Loken starts getting unnerved because again, similar to the Whisperheads thing, instead of the iconic, Samus is here, Samus is the man beside you, they're hearing gurgles and sickly sounds, and it's saying Nergrath, Nergleth, something similar to what will be it's not really a spoiler, but what sounds close to the name of the Chaos God Nurgle.
Yeah.
And the moon is covered in it's when they were last here, it was tribal lands on both Davin and the moon. Now the moon is covered in a dense swamp. and the mortal and Titan elements that we mentioned earlier, like the Dies Irae, they start lagging behind after the landing because they're getting caught up in the swamp. So the Astartes are just pushing forward. And this is where zombies, they find corpses everywhere. Zombies erupt from the swamp and they begin to attack the Sons of Horus. Petronella Vivar has misinterpreted Horus previous to this. She got like a wink and a nod, being like Horus was joking with her, saying, I'm going to go out there and, see real history. And she thought that means she should go record his real history. So she rushes off in a ship to basically capture Horus in the battle zone. This ship accidentally gets shot down because one of the Titans thinks it's an enemy vessel. And they essentially land in the swamp and they get swarmed by zombies. Lots of the crew die. Magard, who's her bodyguard, takes out his blade and starts absolutely ripping and tearing through zombies, but Petronella's like injured and terrified. She's screaming because they're going to die. And then Horus arrives and they cut down the last of these zombies in the area. Horus basically praises Magard. He says, he respects martial prowess like his. And the muted bodyguard literally kneels and cries because, the War Master Horus just said he was a warrior. And he offered him his blade, which Peshnellar kind of realizes like is offering a fealty in some way, which she doesn't really like. Horus and the Mournival and Erebus and his word bearers, their contingent, they all meet up and they finally catch sight of what you mentioned, Ed. I mentioned earlier, Ed, which was the ship of Yugen is not. It's half submerged in the swamp and it's been ruined, and it's clearly been ruined for decades. And so something clearly happened a long time ago, and some signal, the Nurgle, the screaming Vox thing is coming from inside the ship. Loken is actually asked to cover the rear and not go in with Horus. And this is because he suggested to Horus, like, this is probably a trap. You should sit back. And if we learn anything about Horus hates being told what to do. He's like, basically, someone said, "Do you want to go sit on the kiddie seat? You want to sit out this one? We got this." So Horus immediately says no. Like, I think it makes him push even further, and they go in. So Loken is basically sitting on guard duty, and essentially the forces where Loken and Torgadon are, they get attacked by zombies on like the grounding area. They kind of lose contact with the guys going inside the ship. The expedition ventures even further in, so like the little contingent, but a lot of them get separated. So like Abaddon and little Horus Aximan, they're all separated into little pockets. And then they finally reach this point where Horus is kind of alone. Some of his men he sees like corpses of his men. He approaches this throne room and he sees his once quite good friend, the mortal Yugen. Ed, would you describe to me what has happened to Yugen and what is he holding?
Yes, he is a bloated mess at this point in the story. He no longer really looks like Yugen. I think Horus believes him just to be kind of a machination of the warp. Horus does have a bit of an understanding of the warp. I imagine you talked about this in the last episode with Samus. So Horus does have a bit of an understanding here, and so he thinks he's just some sort of creature spawned by the warp, which would also explain the zombie phenomenon that you mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, he's a grotesque monster, and he has a very dark blade, which he's wielding.
Yes, and Horus and Temba begin this fight scene where, surprisingly enough, Horus obviously is a demigod Primarch, but such as the power swell within the bloated form of Yugen, it's kind of almost evenly matched for a certain part of it until Horus does eventually win, but he takes a shoulder wound from the blade which Temba was holding. When Temba is like dying in Horus's arms, a certain like clarity comes over him, and he regrets what's happened to him, but he can't really like say what it was. But he warns Horus like, this great disaster is coming, and then this chaos is coming, and he has to remain strong. And then he basically dies. Horus limps out of the ship, and all the men and everyone goes rushing towards him. And this is where Petronella Vivar screams, and the Mournival
Sorry,
are
actually, do you mind?
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to go back a bit. You want to?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Absolutely, go
But
ahead.
yeah, I was just going to talk about actually just a bit about the fight because
Oh,
it
absolutely,
is,
absolutely.
yeah, just exactly to your point. He is swollen with the power of what we know to be Nurgle, so he would be a relatively tough cookie. I've always presumed that without the blade, this what we'll call the anatheme, the this he probably wouldn't be able to go toe to toe with a Primarch. I think Horus would cut him up pretty handedly, as we see when Primarchs fight demons typically. But yeah, just as you looked at in Horus Rising, because he's got, I'm going to say the anatheme, but in Horus Rising, there's actually multiple anathemes, but this is just one anatheme blade. And just before he goes to fight Horus, he speaks Horus's name to the blade, the War Master Horus, and that makes the blade sentient. So it's essentially it becomes essentially a magical blade. And Eugen Temple was never a swordsman, but all of a sudden, he's able to go toe to toe with a demigod Primarch, and Horus does suspect that the way Temba moves, it definitely looks like it's the blade that is the power here, not so much Temba. And that is why he was able to cut Horus, because and it really shows the power of the Primarchs, really, because this blade, when Temba says Horus's name to the blade, it becomes his anathema. Essentially, it's a weapon that can pierce his defenses and will be the perfect counter to his attacks. But even then, he still can't kill Horus. He can only wound him. But unfortunately, because of the poison within the blade, that is enough.
Yeah, so Petrona's screaming, and the Mournival are stunned to silence because Horus Lupercar's eyes roll to the back of his head and he falls over. And basically, it was unthinkable that the War Master could basically fall because his shoulder wound is still bleeding.
Yeah.
The expedition absolutely roars back to the vengeful spirit, and then there are crowds of humans, like thousands of people are rushing to hear of the beloved War Master. They rush to see what has happened to him. And I'd like to ask Ed, will you describe the scene? What happens when the Sons of Horus disembark with the wounded War Master?
Yes, there's a little bit of a trampling that
A little bit.
that goes on, and yes, it's actually quite a big deal in the novel, and people die.
Quite bloody, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty brutal, and of course it highlights just how the Primarchs aren't gods in the traditional sense, but they're pretty much viewed as gods by their sons, and so if you get in their way, they will just trample you. A lot of the people that are there just want to see a glimpse of Horus, and for their love, they get trampled to death.
I think there's also a part where it was in Horus Rising where Euphrates Keeler notices it, but now a lot of other people here do, which is, when you're actually on the other side fighting the Astartes, you realize how horrifying they are. They're not like this noble empire creators. They're brutal shock troop tanks, essentially. And this is an incident that, poor Malagos, the Equerry, is talking to certain civilian military commanders, is basically like, this is not going to go away. This is going to, this could ruin the expedition if this gets out. They, in the aftermath of this, when people are dead on the floor, Euphrates Keeler appears again, and she starts handing out copies of the Vitio Divinitatis again. So clearly opportunistic. Horus at this point, though, is dying. The anatheme cut, as you said, is literally when he whispered his name into the blade, Eugen Temba, it became like the perfect Primarch killer, essentially. If I remember in the book, it says it literally starts killing, it's almost like it's perfectly coded to his own DNA, so that he can't basically his body couldn't fight it because it's almost like it's him.
Yes.
So
I was just trying to look up what they're called, but yes, we don't know a lot about Primarch physiology. We know a lot about Space Marine physiology. We don't know too much about Primarchs. They do have two hearts, but I think it's something like his Laraman cells or something like that. They're called. They're not. As you say, it's perfectly coded so that they're not working. I was just trying to find it's something like that.
It was a point with the apothecary of the Sons of Horus. He even says I don't know what to do, because he's never thought he'd have to operate on a being that usually super heals in a second. But essentially, it's pretty damn bad. And this is where like the Sons of Horus, they're completely lost. They don't know what to do. Abaddon is raging. Loken is trying to think his way out of it. Torgadon is trying to make jokes. Aximan's crying probably. They're all, they're
Yeah.
struggling. Loken wants to do something about it. So Loken gathers up Nero Vipers, who is his good, as we mentioned slightly in the previous episode, like his good friend. Nero Vipers is a solid individual who has some importance in some stories later, which we'll get to. But him and Torgadon, they basically rush back down to the moon because they want to go find the blade that wounded Horus, because hopefully it would maybe help in some way. Horus is sitting on the apothecary's table and he's kind of half lucid, and he starts to his final wish is to speak to Petronella Vivar and to essentially spill everything. He wants he thinks he's dying, and so therefore he wants to get his story out. So, but he starts to say everything, and the truth and the revelations of what his opinion is, such as I think he talks about, the Imperium is like falling, it's going to be a handover to diplomats and things while warriors built it. And basically Petronella is like, oh my god, this is like the real Horus. I wonder if you thought, Ed, like particularly in this scene, if it's again similar to like what we said earlier, like, is it like an unraveling of like, oh, this is like almost like a child in some way. This is like a immature child, or is this like the ramblings of a dying man essentially?
Yeah, a bit of both, I think. Yeah, it is funny, I guess, that yeah, he goes for Viva, given that she's not who you necessarily want to be around in your
Yeah.
dying hours. But yeah, I think it's a bit of both. He obviously, he is the War Master, and I guess he's thinking a bit about someone's going to take
Legacy.
over this legacy. Yeah.
I think particularly with horror stuff, it's a thing of like you start to, I don't know if you felt this way, but it's like an unraveling of like the charismatic persona is like it reinforced, like it really is a persona. Like the real him actually just wants to shout at people and say, just do your job and do what I tell you to do. It's almost unbearably like people are
Mm.
so slow humans are so slow and
Yeah.
capricious, and they're so like, oh, we want things, we want good lives, and he's like, I just want to be the winner. So
Yeah, I mean, to your point about yeah, like legacy, it's given because Horus's thing, as you mentioned earlier, we'll probably talk about it more in a bit. One of the aspects of Horus that has always suggested he might tend towards damnation, and the multiple characters bring this up to him, is that his thing seems to be ambition. And when I say his thing, I mean that all of the Primarchs kind of have things that make them a little bit different to their brothers. They're a little bit better in certain areas. And one of the things that makes Horus kind of a good candidate for War Master is he has the Emperor's ambition. And so it's pretty fitting that in his final hours, he's just thinking about his legacy and how he'll be remembered.
yeah. As at this point though, Horus again is basically bleeding out. Now he's like lost consciousness. Erebus calls a lodge meeting, and he convinces the desperate Abaddon and Aximan. Torgadon is not there, not present, and Loken is not part of the lodge. He convinces the lodge members, who are, essentially quite a big majority of the Sons of Horus, that Horus is dying. There's nothing else we can do here, but maybe there's this thing called the Serpent Lodge upon Davin, the main planet, and it's a mystical healing temple. And it may, we're desperate. Maybe we should try this out. And obviously, this is a massive no-go against, the Imperial truth and their rejection of mysticism. And they know, like, certain characters like Torgadon and Loken would never agree to something like this because, this is Horus's final moments. Why would you desecrate his memory like that? But the lodge members, too desperate, agree to Erebus's plan. They carry the wounded Horus back in instead of his different like Sons of Green like Horus plate, Sons of Green plate. They change to his ceremonial like traditional white plate, which a lot of artwork shows of him, and they carry him on like shields. And it's a scene where like people are like laying out vigil. They're staying away from the Astartes a bit because of what happened, but they are like laying out candles, and people are like putting things in like sage and like bowstrings and burning it. Like, oh, they're returning back to like weird good luck charms, and people are holding out hope. Some people start literally praying, which is obviously a big, massive, something they were expunging in a lot of other places. I wonder what you thought of the scene itself, though, because obviously it's quite powerful, isn't it?
It is. It is. Yeah, I think it is very powerful. This is where you get. He really leans into the idea of this is like the last moments of kind of good Horus, as it were. To to your point, like you have. I think he says like don't call me War Master, call me Horus. And he's like, he brings in the Mournival and he's talking about, he gives them like, silly nicknames and making fun of them. And it's like this nice little sweet moment. So when he comes out and everyone's kind of crying and literally praying, then it kind of, it's fitting because just being in the presence of Primarchs has a huge effect. But Horus is at this point one of the good ones as well.
Which also it's interesting that in the face of such desperation, the people's resolve and other thing that their beliefs kind of slightly crumble, which obviously is a very good theme for the entire Horus Heresy in some way. Loken and Torgadon, though, they do find the Anathame blade and they recognize it as the Anathame. And there's only one place that could have come from, which is the Interrex, which they obviously were blamed for taking. The only way it could get onto this planet, someone clearly did steal it, and it was from the expedition that they were in. And
Dun, dun, dun.
they think they know who brought it here. Or at least they have some pretty strong suspicions of who they think it is. Another scene switch here, which is to our boy Ignace Carcassy again. He had a little conversation with a very, very drunk Petron Levivar, who, overwhelmed by the revelations of Horus, Ignace Carcassy obviously saw the stampede of civilians and how the Astartes did not care. So he decided that he's going to create like a printing paper and then stamp this all around the ships, and they're going to know the truth. It says life work. He's called to. He's been struggling with ideas and his terrible poetry before, but he's been called to this. Let people know the truth, and essentially that's going to be a big headache for a lot of stuff. There's another scene switch here, which is basically Horus is brought into the Serpent Lodge and the doors are shut. Horus awakens in this dreamland. He thinks he's dead, but he's not sure. There's images of this like one-eyed wolf or a pack of one-eyed wolves that are chasing him. Doesn't like this. He runs away from it. He finds a body like floating in this small lake, and he lifts it up and he sees it's his dead but beloved son, Hasta Sejanus. And if people remember from Horus Rising, Hasta Sejanus was like essentially his like favorite son in the very beginning of Horus Rising. He was sent to talk with the false emperor at the very beginning, and it was basically slain by his invisible guards. So Hasta's been dead for a little while, but Hasta Sejanus, basically his favorite kid, is here. And Sejanus, interesting enough, Sejanus starts like rubbing his throat, like almost like he thinks he was injured there, which is a slight hint to something there. And this Sejanus, Hasta Sejanus, starts saying, thank God I'm here, because I've learned the truth, man. I've learned hidden things. I've learned the truth about the warp and the things that live there. Horus is not with it. He does believe at this point kind of that this is Hasta. And essentially, he doesn't know what's happening. The world around him is crumbling. And Hasta drags Horus into another vista away from these chasing wolves. Horus and Hasta then appear on this world that's full of people praying and pilgrims. What do they see when they appear on this like enormous world? I'd say I don't want to give too many hints for your stuff, but they've appeared, and essentially this is supposedly not now but another time.
Hasta is starting to, Hasta in quotation marks is starting to reveal what awaits the Imperium under what he deems to be the true plans of the Emperor.
Hasta, I say, shows him this massive shrine world. There are statues everywhere, and it's implied like this is the 41st millennium, and this is an entire world that's given over to essentially worshipping the Emperor as a god. And the funny part here, I don't know, like this always cracks me up, but it's just like Horus is appalled that, we've been cleansing the galaxy of gods and false worship. But the thing that's more appalling to Horus is that Horus is not amongst the statues of Primarchs that are like venerated and worshipped. I always found that quite a
yeah, this is always one of those scenes that this is the scene that I think about when I think of Horus's fall to chaos, because yes, exactly to your point, Horus is kind of just annoyed that he doesn't have a statue, because of course this is the vision of the future, and so it's only the loyalist Primarchs that have got statues in this place, and Horus doesn't have one naturally. So therefore, he thinks that, like, he's been forgotten about or betrayed, and the Emperor has a history of kind of forgetting about people and betraying them. And Hasta has started to mention, that maybe the Emperor has been tinkering with powers that he really shouldn't have, and maybe that's why he's got rid of other people's gods, because he wants to take their place. I don't know. Just throwing out ideas, Horus.
Horus is properly freaking out as well at this point. He runs through, like, he can't really interact with the people there, like subtly can in some ways, and he's having a bit of a meltdown internally about, there's no way this is the future, or like Hass is like, this is the future that will come to pass. The Emperor's gonna do this is the world you're building and you're not in it. Obviously, again, as a man who's focused so much on legacy, what we mentioned earlier, obviously this is like a big stab in his heart. He can't fathom it. Simultaneously as well, like at this time, Loken and Torgadon do also go to the Lodge Temple, because they're like, we're going to get Horus out. And there are crowds of people surrounding. Some people are praying, which looks very much looks like they're praying, or, like there's like a whole vigil of people, like a massive crowd of people surrounding this and hoping for the War Master's recovery. They are blocked by Abaddon and Horus Axiomand and other members of the Sons of Horus Command, because they said, this is the last chance we've got. We don't care.
Yeah.
Loken is talking about how, this is like a betrayal of all the, the imperial truth and all we stand for. And they're like, we don't care. We love Horus. This is where like Loken and Torgadon, like they're not willing to kill their own brothers, such as the Bond. So they're kind of, there's a stalemate now, and they have to wait it out. So several days they'll have to basically be stood outside the Lodge's temple doors. The scene changes again to where Hasta takes Horus to another place. It looks to be a dungeon, and he says it's deep below Terra. This is where Horus will see the Primarch project. He sees his own younger self, and I don't know does he hint to here like the missing Primarchs? I can't remember if it was directly in the book. I think he said like there's a Prime. Well, that might be in the Wordbearers book. Apologies. I think they hint to a Primarch that is no longer with us. But essentially, Horus sees the fact that there are wards and there are things to protect the Primarchs from the warp, which basically has reinforced the fact like Erebus has been, not Erebus, Hasta has been telling the truth about the fact that, the Emperor knows of the warp and he's been communing with powers, stuff like this. So, why would the Emperor protect from those powers if they're not real? So the Emperor knows there are gods, basically. That's the interpretation it leads it with. And Horus is utterly shattered. He doesn't know what to do. This is when Hasta tells him like the event is happening, and basically the scattering of they are here in time to see the scattering of the Primarchs, and they're basically the Primarchs are in their capsules. They are ripped from their holds and they are sent into the warp. Custodes appear here as well. They try and attack Horus because they think he's like an apparition or like something evil. So Horus actually ends up killing Custodes, and I would say kind of enjoying it. Not gonna lie, he seemed to be having a bit of time for that. There's another slight scene change here in the book where it's like the side plot happening with like the mortal humans, where we see like Euphrates Keeler, and she meets up with Kirol Sinderman, who's obviously the iterator / personal tutor of Loken. Sinderman throughout the book has been slightly helping Loken with like nudges of like the links to Erebus and like myths and mythologies and demons and possession. They were trying to translate some of the writings like Erebus has on himself, and they accidentally summon a demon in the middle of the ship. This is where Keeler, obviously spreader of imperial faith in the Levisio Divinitatis, she uses her own faith like a power and actually banishes the demon alongside one of the navigators of the ship. So, and then she basically falls unconscious, which is the interesting part because it shows like, oh my god, faith is actually like a real thing in Warhammer. Like it manifests as like a power. Would you say it's a
Yes.
warp power? This is like a big thing in Warhammer. Is it like a warp power, or is it something kind of
Yeah.
different?
So there's an explanation given in a later novel that which I always assumed and I always took to be correct, which is that faith is like everybody in the galaxy, unless you're a blank, which is like one in billions, unless you're someone that's born without a soul, you have a soul that's very, very small. And psychers, people that can actually command psychic powers, like Magnus, as we'll talk about later, they have essentially just larger souls that burn brighter in the warp, is the terminology used. And so that's why they can kind of use warp magic, right? But then you have everyone else, and they just have really smaller souls, so they can't use warp magic. But if you have enough of them believing the same thing, then it creates a reflection within the warp, which then can come back and affect reality. What's interesting to your what you suggest about being controversial is that in like modern Warhammer 40k lore, there's like conflicts with a race known as the Necrons, and the Necrons have technology which can essentially sever a connection between the warp and real space, reality. And even when that happens, the powers of faith still seem to work, albeit they're dulled slightly. So it suggests that they don't work like psychic powers, where I kind of always assumed they sort of vaguely did. But yeah,
It's a tricky one, but this is like in terms of in universe in the Horus Heresy and Great Crusade. This is like the first instance of like belief in the Emperor has shaped like it changed reality. Literally, someone's religious faith actually manifests as a power, and it banished the demon. We have another scene change here where we catch up back to Horus, who's been in the warp, and he's obviously like Haster's been whispering in his ear the entire time. When finally the wolves that have been chasing catch up to Horus and Haster, and this is where we eventually see that Magnus the Red, who's his brother Primarch, great psyker and power. He's been essentially trying to warn Horus the entire time. He's basically saying, don't believe, I've been trying to tell you that this thing is happening. They're trying to corrupt you to this thing called chaos. This is where Magnus will reveal that Haster is not Haster, in fact. Much as Horus had been suspecting it wasn't the real Haster, it's actually been Erebus the entire time. Erebus had his throat slit in the Serpent Lodge as well, and had his soul taken into the warp to help corrupt Horus. Erebus is like speaking to Horus, he wants him to betray the Emperor, these are all these truths. The Emperor's going to turn himself into a god and all that stuff. Magnus says, don't be faithful, he's a liar, he's using powers of the warp that are corrupted. I wonder your opinion, Ed, on this. Like, how do you think, because I don't think in this scene particularly, like, Magnus did a very good job at, like, convincing Horus, like, not to betray the Imperium. I'd always thought, like, and obviously maybe it's, like, destined to happen in some way, but Magnus kind of messed it up, in my opinion. What do you think?
yes, I get what you mean. He could have done better. I think especially because, like, we've been saying Sejanus the whole time, but in the Horus has been talking to this, apparition of Sejanus that's really been. Have you said really been Erebus?
Yeah, we just said he's been Erebus. Yes.
Okay, yeah,
it's all right.
Who's really been Erebus all along. But even still, Horus has known something is not right. He's known. He keeps saying like, oh, maybe Sejanus, if that's your real name. He can tell that this isn't really Sejanus, not just because his son is dead, but because something is clearly off. And Sejanus is supposed to have been like one of the greatest space marines ever, right? And this guy evidently sucks. So even with that, Magnus is still unable to convince Horus not to betray his father. And a lot of the logic that is used in this this book is not very strong. Like we mentioned the we mentioned the fact that he has he's annoyed by the statues. Of course, when he's in the room, he talks about, he fights against the custodians turn up and start shooting at him. He actually talks to Valdor, Constantine Valdor, who's the captain general of the custodian guard, and someone that Horus knows very well. And Valdor will have nigh on perfect memory, and yet for some reason has never mentioned to Horus that he saw Horus when Horus was a baby as like an apparition, because Valdor just thinks that Horus is some sort of demonic conjuration. And you would have thought Valdor would have mentioned that. And as you go on to talk about Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, we'll know that the sequence of events in this book, in this vision we know is not correct. He might have actually seen a shrine world of the 41st millennium. That might have been true, but we know that this scene is not correct because in Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, we know that Valdor doesn't get to the room till after the Emperor. So this is definitely a fake scene, and Horus must be able to tell this. Do you know what I mean? So Horus's logic here is not very strong, in my opinion. It's not a redeeming moment for him.
I think he walks away with it with the impression that there's truth and light. So Magnus says, the whole point that Magnus fails at was him saying, Erebus points out you use warp magic, don't you, as well? You're basically the same thing. And I think Horus walked away with certain truths that are he believes the Emperor is going to turn himself into a god of worship of God, and that he and other Primarchs will be expunged from history. And then it combined with his earlier feelings of, when he was on his deathbed saying to Petronella, the Imperium is being handed over to bureaucrats and, sycophants and other stuff. So I assume he believed that, this future is going to happen because I've already seen the foundations of it happening now. But he also thinks Erebus is a massive liar in some parts, and that maybe there are these gods in the warp and maybe their powers are manifest, but I don't have to serve them like you do, or like supposedly he says, like Erebus says, Lorgar's been inducted, and then Horus gets a little bit jealous because like, what do you mean you picked Lorgar first? You wouldn't if there are these chaos gods, they wouldn't pick me first. I'm Horus. So I think he walks, like he says at the end of the embattling conversation between Magnus and Erebus, demon and angel on his shoulder, he says, I'm picking no one's side except my own. I'm going to choose what I want to do, which I assume he basically means he's going to stop the Emperor creating this evil future, but he's also not going to serve chaos. But I guess also slightly Erebus kind of lies and says, they only want to stop the Emperor because the Emperor is like harming their realm. They don't really care about the material verse, which obviously is a massive lie. We then, after the scene...
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say, one thing that Horus brings up to Magnus, which I guess does make Magnus look bad, is that some context that will become much more important in later books is that the concept of space marine librarians or space marine psychers used to be a big thing within the legions. However, after a sequence of events involving Magnus himself, the Emperor passed the Edict of Nicaea, which meant that they were no longer allowed to dabble in the warp as they used to. And so the fact that Magnus has contacted Horus at all through the visage of a wolf, essentially using psychic powers to reach him in this realm, that alone is illegal, as it were, via his father's rules. So Horus is throwing this accusation that Erebus is a liar right back at Magnus and saying, like, how can you say he's a liar when you're literally breaking one of the Emperor's, and like when the Emperor tells everybody not to use psychic powers, he doesn't just say please, he says something like I will hunt you until the end of all things, or something like that.
Pretty.
So this is a big no-no what Magnus is doing, and so I guess in that respect it's understandable that he didn't believe Magnus, but it's funny.
The post this, though, the doors of the Serpent Lodge swing open. All the Mournival, all the expedition basically are watching as the man himself, Horus Lupercal, is walking, and he is well, and he is healed. Yes. And even Loken or Torgadon, like, as much as like they're like something really fishy has been going on here, everyone is completely overjoyed, and it's it's literally, someone says like it's a miracle, which obviously is not language for an atheistic culture to really be espousing, but Horus lives. And then there's another scene shift here where like months have passed, and the 63rd expedition are fighting something called the Horatian Technocracy, which so this conflict is just happening, and this initially.
Sorry, actually,
Oh, go ahead. Absolutely, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say
No, go for it.
one thing that I always think about with this book. In terms of Erebus, you mentioned that Erebus was like, touching his throat.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the the reason for that is because his throat was actually cut by a lodge priestess.
Akshub, I think her name
Yes,
was. Yeah,
and when he dies, because he has to die to go into this realm, because Horus is basically dying, as it were, and the power of the Chaos Gods has brought him back from death. And so as he dies, he goes, "When I get back to life, I'm going to kill that bitch." And
yeah.
yes, one of the very very sharp words for a 40k book, so it always sticks out to me.
We'll have to see if he makes good on that. But him and that Akshub will speak again at some point, though, which be a bit of a while in the Horus Heresy, but they will speak again. There's a cool Erebus short story about. He kind of has like a Jedi training montage, something later. It's hilarious. So the 63rd expedition is fighting the Horatian Technocracy when they first encountered them. It was almost like they were a mini Imperium. Like everyone almost was like, wow, they were shocked when they first encountered them, because they essentially had like civilians in powered armor who looked kind of like mini Space Marines, but not like genetically altered, and they dressed the same way. They had a lot of similar languages and cultures. They like, it was a big reunion. So like, oh my god, the culture from Terra has appeared, and they're basically so similar. It was a great meeting. But Horus decried, the war started because Horus said they tried to assassinate him when they were essentially on their first meeting. One of the guys lifted up his like cane to say like in greeting, and then the Sons of Horus fired upon them. They didn't have any armor or weapons or anything on, but they said in propaganda later, like they had, like he raised his gun first, officer, he shot first, sort of thing. And this happened the moment that the Horatian Technocracy governor said they had an STC. Would you care to explain, Ed, what is an STC?
Yes, an STC for the uninitiated is a standard template construct. So it possesses incredible knowledge from the dark age of technology, which I don't know if something that you'll have talked about previously, but important to the backstory of the Horus Heresy and the Great Crusade is that humanity has spent 5,000 years in strife, in the Age of Strife, where all the worlds of humanity were disconnected. And prior to that, and the exact things that caused the Age of Strife are we have some insights, but it's very cloudy. But for about 10,000 years, we lived in what's called the Dark Age of Technology, which is called such because we know so little about it. And an STC has knowledge from that time where humanity was at its technological zenith, and finding STC or parts of an STC are regular plot points within Warhammer 40k, because you can unlock brand new technologies essentially, or rediscover them.
Incredibly valuable, especially to ones of the Mechanicum / Mechanicus. Those are the priests of Mars who are obsessed with technology and basically maintain all the equipment of any imperial civilization or any legion or anything like that.
It's funny. It's funny you say that, because in the early days of this, the Horus Heresy, what Horus is starting to think about is who can he get onto his side. Of course, there's the Space Marine legions, which he hopes he can kind of win round with his, brotherly bonds, and passionate speeches. But can he get, how many Titan legions can he get on board? We spoke about how important they are, and getting a lot of the Martians on board is incredibly important. So he's going to have enough arms and enough weapons to restock throughout the war. And so this STC actually becomes important, because this is something he can offer the tech priests of Mars, because the Emperor often historically doesn't allow them to access all kinds of technology. Some types of technology the Emperor has forbade. And so they're going to be very happy to get, because the tech priests of Mars is quite a funny thing in that they don't like develop technology as it were, but they are allowed to rediscover technology because they believe that everything that humanity used to have, even though it wasn't the most powerful galaxy the universe has ever seen, there's this quote where they talk about it being like the perfect level of technology. So STCs are get you back to that level, which is what they want.
No such thing as like abominable intelligence like AI, or no. I think the greatest sin is innovation, I think they even say. So they're pretty. Horus is eyeing up. I wouldn't say Horus is corrupted by chaos, but Horus is, in his mind, betrayed the Emperor and the Imperium. And he's, they're kind of, well, it's arguable if he is corrupted by chaos in some way, because it's later on there'll be a more obvious answer to that question.
He's definitely on the way, I'd say, because he died essentially. Like this weapon killed him. Because his blood wouldn't clot, and like Erebus, Erebus had to die to get to this realm. So presumably he was in the realm of death.
Yeah. And this is, basically sides are going to be drawn up in the coming future. And we switch to where the lodge itself in the legions, they summon Mr. Chuckles himself, Mr. Torgadon, and the lodge is fully behind Horus. Horus has been feeding them info over months, which basically has been bring them away from like thinking about the emperor as the head of the state and more like him, accruing loyalty to him. And they need a name to blame for the civilian stampede thing that Ignace Carcassy has been spreading, and it's creating problems back at Terra because they're going to get investigated and it's going to be a huge scandal, and they would like a name. And the lodge says they need Tarek, they need everyone to agree to blame Garvey or Loken. But Tarek absolutely refuses. He doesn't know what's become of his brothers, and it's like it's a stick in a hard place for him because he can't betray either one of them in a way. Like they're all his brothers, so he just refuses and he says he's leaving the lodge. And Loken at this time is incredibly suspicious. I mean, he also feels like slightly powerless because he's obviously kind of out of favor with he argued to not basically heal Horus, essentially, so he's a bit low in the pecking order. He gave the anatheme, which he found on Davin's moon, to the apothecary, and then he finds out later when Fulgrim and the Emperor's children visited Horus during the middle of this Horatian technocracy war, that the anatheme was actually given over to the Emperor's children, which seems even more suspicious. And Loken and Torgadon are the favor they're clearly out of is evident when they are sent to be essentially cannon fodder in this last charge against the Horatian technocracy's home base. They fight alongside the World Eaters who have turned up, who there's not enough time to go into too much World Eater lore because obviously they'll be their own thing, but obviously the Berserker savages that are known as the World Eaters, who have the biting nails implement onto their head. They don't fight like normal Astartes, but Loken and Torgadon are sent into this massive conflict. The battle is pretty brutal, and Loken doesn't feel good about killing men who probably didn't at any point deserve to die. Clearly Horus has set off this war for some reason, and they fall into this massive trap. They get almost killed, Torgadon and Loken, and then there's a huge explosion. Angron of the World Eaters is thought to have been killed. But he's not. He's buried under a mountain of rubble, and when he emerges, the Horatian technocracy had basically surrendered to Loken and the party. Angron, with the butcher's nails implement in his head, he can't even think straight. He didn't care, and he's just started killing. So they kill the Horatian technocracy surrender party. Loken also notices that certain Imperial army or other influential people have been subtly killed off as well during the attack. They were actually killed by Astartes bolters, which is really obviously suspicious. And the book ends with the fact that Magard, who was obviously the bodyguard for Petronella Vivar, he gets recruited by Horus into the lodge, the warrior lodge, because it's a place for warriors. And Horus meets with Petronella Vivar and basically says to her, your book, you've been making, I heard, you basically, she got really drunk at one point because she was overwhelmed by the revelations, and then she picked up again, sort of her, I should say before this as well, Magard also kills Ignace Carcassy inside his room and makes it look like a suicide. So poor Ignace Carcassy, R.I.P. I know he might have been a fan favorite for a lot of people early on. He dies, which is pretty horrifying for a lot of his friends of his, like Euphrates Keeler and Mercedes Allerton and Cinderman. Like they're all pretty shocked by that. Passion Vivar starts to cry when she realizes, like, oh, Horus is not going to let me publish my work. In fact, he's not going to let me live because Horus is ready to betray the Imperium, and he's like, I don't need secrets getting out early. So he literally just picks her up, and then he says like he literally just like ragdolls her head a little bit, and he's like snaps her neck. And
Yeah.
I remember because I asked Graham McNeil, he's often spoken about this quite a few times. He mentioned like how it was meant to be kind of extra horrifying because even though in the beginning of the book you don't really like her, at the end you're like, she doesn't deserve to die. So it's a bit like, oh, Horus is like, he's evil now. And the book kind of ends with they're going to Loken and Torgadon said, no matter what comes next, we're going to fight for the Emperor and the Imperium and for our Legion. We're going to make sure our brothers are strong and we'll find a way to help them and get past whatever this corruption is within the Legion. And the book ends with them heading to this next engagement on the world of Istvan. I was going to ask Ed, like, what do you think of the? I would say I really enjoyed. Like, I think Horus Rising is probably a top 10 Warhammer book. How would you feel about False Gods and like yourself? Your review of it, like, did you think it was like pretty good? Did you have any problems with certain parts of it, or like, what's your overall thoughts?
I think that you know what I'll do. What's this say to do a sandwich? I'll do a sandwich. My favorite thing about the book is that it's a really good introduction of these two sides of you get how if you were like me and you hadn't read other books before you started reading the Horus Heresy, the revelation that faith is real is actually is unbelievable. It's a fascinating scene in the passage, and everyone is very shocked to discover this. Before that, you just think it's just like a weird cult that's been seeded throughout the Great Crusade. And the other side of that, of course, is you get to see that actually the true power of chaos, and then you also get the raw power of kind of Xenos technology because the nature of the anatheme in Horus Rising is like it's like the metallurgy forges and stuff. So it's not officially chaos. So you have these three massive elements to the setting, and so the concept of who is the false god is and who are the real gods is up for you to decide. The thing that I've always been a little bit funny on with this is this is Horus's fall to chaos, as I mentioned earlier. I think they would have done better to pick a way of how Horus is going to fall and have it go that way. The problem with Black Library authors sometimes is that Primarchs have to be the most incredible, greatest guys always. And that's very hard to write because Black Library authors are amazing, but they are not actually 10-foot tall demigods. So it's very hard to write that believably. And so, for example, he sort of sees through the Sejanus ruse pretty quickly. He doesn't see its Erebus till Magnus moves away the mask, but he sees it through pretty quickly, and he understands enough about the warp that he can sort of understand what's going on. And yet he still basically falls for this. And I like that always kind of annoyed me. So not annoyed, but I always thought that was a little bit odd. And, likewise, you have Horus's ambition is very much a thing that's mentioned multiple times. And so that's, again, was his fall to chaos sort of inevitable? It was always going to happen in that respect. But then the concept, at the end of the book, Loken is starting to suspect, of course, that there are some bad actors within the Legion, but the concept of Horus turning against his father is inconceivable. And so I think they would have done a better job if there had been a clear route to Horus's fall to chaos that they built up over the novel. Instead, it just felt like I guess you can say it's lots of little things, but none of them seem impactful enough, even together, that he should have fallen to chaos. Do you know what I mean?
I do think I always say, particularly obviously it's hard to do it justice in this format, but particularly character dialogue is pretty damn good in this book, I would say. Like particularly talks between Loken and Kirill Sinderman, where it very clearly comes across like the intelligence of the author in terms of like lending credence to what was like a journey of discovering this big mystery of like this background chaos thing. I think certain characters are funny. I did like Ignace Carcassy quite a lot in terms of like as like I think because Colin had pretty said to me in Horus Rising that a lot of the human characters kind of stand out so well in a lot of these books, particularly. I think I didn't get a clear mention of him in this book, but there is like a Imperial commander. I've forgotten unfortunately the name of him, but there's an interesting Imperial military commander who's also part of this, and he talks to Malagos when the stampede thing happens. So there are like other parts and side characters, like much like the whole story revolves around Horus and Logan and the demigods and all these Astartes, but the human characters I think often do a lot of the heavy lifting for really good world building. I'd say within this book, Keela, Cinnamon, Mercedes, the parts with like the Titans, like the small side stories are where people are like beginning to start worshipping the Emperor, and I think they give a really like I would say the book is pretty. I have some issues with it in terms of, like, I agree with like the Horus Fall thing is almost a bit too nah, but yeah, like yeah, but so but overall, I'd say it's a pretty. It does show like the overall quality of so much Horus Heresy material. Like there's some really damn good things out there, and obviously the entirety of the Horus Heresy is an incredible. Like just think about the entire Horus Heresy as one piece of work. It's
Yeah.
nuts.
I think to your point about dialogue, the way the Mournival are written, it between the two books is so good, because going in to Warhammer 40k, it's very easy to think like, I mean, isn't just a Space Marine a Space Marine? Like I mentioned earlier, they're sort of indoctrinated, faithful servants of the Emperor, demigods. But between those four characters, you'll grow incredibly attached to Torgadon, and hope nothing bad ever happens to him. But likewise, there are significant differences between Abaddon and Little Horus Eximand. So you have this huge. They really demonstrate kind of solid writing that they can make you feel so attached to something that is, in its essence, so inhuman.
Yeah, I think I would probably put it in if it was top 10. I would say maybe number 10, but as in obviously there's loads of Warhammer books, but I think particularly for people listening, it's sometimes hard to get across how we're talking about the events that happen to these characters, but very much there's a certain amount of like charisma, and you kind of fall in love with a lot of these moments with the characters in because they get across personality so well in a lot of these. But they're not just like standard brother sort of Astarte. They're in a way like they're real people, but they're also childlike in their misunderstanding of what is like mature human experiences because they've been turned into child super soldiers. So
It's one of those things as well where one of the things about 40k and the heresy is you find yourself coming back to thinking about these scenes. Like you mentioned the trampling that goes on, and when Loken of course is very angry that they've gone to the Davin warrior lodges, and Aximand and Abaddon are just panicking, and you find out more later on into the heresy about why these things are so big, because you find out about what it was like, for example, when there were no Primarchs and what happened to the legions, and that was a disaster for multiple legions. So it becomes you understand why they're panicking so much. Losing your Primarch, it's in a way it's so much worse than just like losing a father, because it's going to have a real impact on you. It's gonna have a physical impact on you, essentially, as that's how big a deal it is to lose your Primarch. So it's amazing how these things last. I will say, in terms of like a rating, the first 5 books, I would say for me are all must reads. There'll definitely be books in the heresy, if you're kind enough to have me back, where we might go like, this was fun, but I wouldn't necessarily say you should always read this. But the first 5, I would definitely say all must reads in my opinion.
I say thank you so much, Ed, for joining on this second episode. Only 2 books in, but we've got a lot, a lot of space and a lot of room to cover there. I hope people listening have enjoyed, and the next part will be the book called Galaxy in Flames, which is no spoilers for that yet, but it was another enjoyable read, and I think everyone will enjoy that. Thank you, Ed. Obviously, Sam Terra has a fantastic channel. He's got all kinds of like a lot of some of it is I would describe it as like it would be someone's perfect intro to 40k, and yet someone's also like the best way to talk about the most in-depth things in Warhammer. So amazing channel in terms of the amount of like clearly well-researched lore that you've put into each video you do. You don't, no, this boy does not slack on anything, and I thoroughly recommend. Obviously, most people have probably already heard of it by now, but definitely go check it out if you want to know. I would say even like mysteries and other things, like incredible things that are like worth seeing how unique the Warhammer universe can be, and it's incredibly enjoyable.
Oh, very, very kind. I mean, it's funny. I actually, when you asked if I wanted to come on, and obviously I hadn't read the Heresy for a long
Yeah,
time.
been a while for a few
So
people. Yeah.
hence a hazy memory or something. Sorry, folks. But I had reread a couple of the scenes from this book not too long ago, because this book is actually super relevant in modern 40k lore. I can't really say more without some big spoilers, but yeah, if you were a fan of my channel, you might notice I was talking about false gods not a bit last year, because it actually got brought up in a very right at the forefront of modern 40k lore. Really, that was quite so. Yeah, stay tuned.
That being said, though, I hope everyone really enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you guys all on the next one. And hopefully, you guys will enjoy more Horus Heresy lore. Thank you guys for listening. Catch you guys later. Peace.